By 1453, the Hundred Years' War was over. France inflicted a serious defeat on England, who lost all of their continental holdings in Europe, save for Calais. The French House of Valois retained the French throne. England was forced to abandon its claims to the French throne, and the conclusion of the conflict led to a strengthening of the French monarchy. On the other hand, the English monarchy had been extremely weakened, causing England to descend into civil war during the decades that followed. Now with the English threat seemingly neutralized, the Kingdom of France was now free to consolidate and expand its territory even more. After the death of Charles the Bold at the Battle of Nancy in 1477, France and the Holy Roman Empire would clash over control of the Duchy of Burgundy. The war that followed would ultimately result in the Netherlands, Lorraine, and other Burgundian territories being partitioned between Valois France and the Austrian Habsburgs in 1482. However, in addition to Burgundy, France had other ambitions for territorial expansion as well. In southern Italy, the King of France, Charles VIII, also had a weak claim to the throne of Naples because of his grandfather, King Charles VII, who married Marie of Anjou of the Angevin dynasty, the family who had ruled Naples previously. And so in 1494, using this dynastic claim as justification, King Charles invaded Italy. This invasion started a long and bloody conflict called the Italian Wars, in which the major powers of Europe fought for supremacy over the Italian peninsula. Initially, the French were successful in capturing Naples, but this French aggression concerned many of the other Italian states, so much so that many of them joined the League of Venice to resist them. On July 6, 1495, the French army met the League of Venice at the Battle of Fornovo. The battle ended with a tactical victory for the French. However, the campaign cost them their conquest in Naples, and they were forced to retreat back to France. In 1498, Charles VIII died and was succeeded by his cousin, Louis XII. Under his reign, the conflict in Italy continued. The Second Italian War was fought from 1499 to 1504, and the third between 1508 and 1516. The Holy Roman Empire, Spain, and Austria would also campaign in Italy, and over time, the conflict evolved into a clash of titans between the French House of Valois and the Habsburgs of Austria and Spain, with the Italian states such as Milan, Genoa, Venice, Florence, and the Papal States stuck in the middle. Although the French fought and won many victories at Fornovo in 1495, Anadello in 1509, and Ravenna in 1512, the French struggled to maintain territory in Italy. In 1515, Francis I became King of France, and with his leadership, France invaded Italy again and regained much of their lost territory in northern Italy, including the Duchy of Milan. After the death of Maximilian I of House Habsburg in 1519, his grandson, Charles V, the King of Spain, Archduke of Austria, and Duke of Burgundy, became the new Holy Roman Emperor. This made Charles V the most powerful man in Europe. France was now surrounded by enemies on all sides, and further conflict in Italy became inevitable. Charles V struck first, invading the Duchy of Milan in 1521 and defeating the French at the Battle of Bicocca in 1522. Francis recruited a new army in 1523, and in October, the French entered Italy with an army of over 25,000 troops. However, the French failed to take any decisive action before the winter. Spanish and imperial forces continued to grow, and the Allied army's numbers grew to over 30,000. Having lost the initiative, French forces then retreated, intending to reorganize and return with greater forces. In 1524, an army of 10,000 Spanish and imperial forces under the leadership of Charles de Bourbon invaded southern France and laid siege to the city of Marseille in September. When an army led by King Francis I himself arrived in southern France, they were forced to retreat. The French king now had an army of over 40,000 marching towards Italy with haste. intending to reach Milan first and cut off Charles de Bourbon from the rest of the imperial army. In mid-October, Francis crossed the Alps. However, Bourbon's forces moved more quickly and joined the remaining Habsburgs, led by Charles de Lannoy. Lannoy soon realized that Milan's fortifications were too weak to defend, however, and so the Habsburg forces withdrew to Lodi on October 26. The French quickly took control of Milan. King Francis, rather than pursue the retreating Spanish, then decided to march on Pavia, where a significant Spanish garrison of 9,000 men, commanded by Antonio de Leyva, still remained. On the 28th of October, French forces besieged the city of Pavia, crossing into Visconti Park, a walled deer park north of the city. The main force, including the French king, made camp in Visconti Park, while the remaining forces surrounded the city and immediately began an artillery bombardment. By mid-November, the French guns managed to breach the walls of Pavia, and de Leyva began building defenses within the city. On November 21st, French troops launched an assault on the city. This assault failed due to overwhelming fire from the imperial arquebusiers within the city, and King Francis ordered a retreat. Despite this momentary setback, the French king ordered the siege to continue, hoping to starve out the Spanish and imperial defenders. Although the French outnumbered the Spanish garrison by almost 6-1, the siege of Pavia dragged on for months, through December. The city had plenty of food and ammunition, but the Spanish commander lacked the funds to pay his Landsknecht mercenaries. By Christmas of 1525, de Leyva resorted to paying his mercenaries with melted down gold and silver from Pavia's churches. Meanwhile, the French army was also being weakened by cold and disease, and Charles V, who was in Madrid, was growing impatient. The emperor demanded to know why the imperial commander, Charles de Lannoy, was doing nothing to raise the siege, despite having an army of 15,000 men sitting idle in Lodi. Lannoy complained that he did not have enough men to relieve the garrison. In response, the emperor ordered Georg von Frundsberg, a legendary German captain, to raise an additional army and march on Pavia. By the end of January 1525, Frundsberg arrived in Lodi with a force of 20,000 men, joined forces with de Lannoy, and arrived before the gates of Pavia by the 2nd of February. The German and Spanish forces set up camp around Casa de Levari, east of the city. Lannoy was still cautious of the French knights and their Swiss mercenary pikemen, however, and so rather than attacking directly, he resorted to a strategy of artillery bombardment. Despite some initial success taking out the French guns, the situation was becoming critical. De Leyva had no money to pay his mercenaries inside the city. Frundsberg and Lannoy were running out of money for their troops as well, and the Emperor, Charles V, was demanding immediate action. Something had to give. Finally, Lannoy settled on a plan. Under the cover of darkness, Frundsberg and Lannoy would march north around the walls of Visconti Park. After breaching the northern wall, Spanish and imperial troops were to attack Mirabello Castle, the presumed headquarters of the French king. At the same time, part of the garrison led by de Leyva would, upon a signal, sally forth from the city and also attack the French from the rear. If all went according to plan, Lannoy was hoping that the French king could be quickly captured at Mirabello, and the battle would be over before it started. If the French king escaped or was not there, at the very least Lannoy was hoping the Spanish garrison at Pavia would join his forces in an orderly withdrawal to Lodi, where both forces could await the arrival of more reinforcements, better weather, and pay for their mercenaries. On the evening of February 23rd, a group of Spanish began marching north in order to breach the walls of the park. French cavalry were patrolling the area and noticed the advancing Spanish. However, they ignored them as they mistakenly thought they were retreating. By the early morning of the 24th, the engineers had succeeded in destroying the walls. 3,000 Neapolitan arquebusiers were the first to enter the park. They immediately marched south and seized the castle Mirabello. However, the French king was not there. Unbeknownst to Lannoy, King Francis was in a separate camp near the park's northwestern gate. Nevertheless, the Imperial troops took control of the castle and began looting the French baggage train. Imperial troops tried to move south, but French artillery caught them in the open, and they were forced to retreat back to the castle. Lannoy had now lost the element of surprise, and his surprise attack was now rapidly becoming a full-scale battle. As Spanish and Imperial troops continued to pour into the park, 3,000 French and Swiss pikemen, a French artillery battery, and a small group of French heavy cavalry rushed forward, attempting to cover the breach. One Spanish artillery battery, heading for Castle Mirabello, was caught in the open and captured by the French heavy cavalry. Delannoy acted quickly and divided his forces into two columns. The first column, led by Frundsberg and his 8,000 German Landsknechts, marched south and engaged the French and Swiss pikemen guarding the eastern portion of the park. Although these French forces were outnumbered, the fight dragged on for hours. Meanwhile, the second column, consisting of Spanish cavalry and infantry commanded by Delannoy himself, marched west towards the French king's camp in the park fields west of Castle Mirabello. However, by now the French king was well aware of the situation, and he ordered the French guns to open fire on the advancing Spaniards, killing thousands of men. A force of 2,000 Spanish horsemen led the Spanish army's advance. The French king, Francis I, formed up his elite heavy cavalry, the gendarmes, and attacked. Francis himself led the charge. The charge of the French gendarmes decimated the Spanish horsemen, and the Lannoy's infantry, who were not far behind, panicked at the sight of this. However, rather than withdrawing his cavalry and ordering his own infantry to deal with the enemy pikemen and arquebusiers, Francis boldly pressed on, charging the Spanish and Imperial infantry head-on. The Allied infantry held the line. Within minutes, the French knights were all but surrounded, and the French king was fighting for his life. On top of this, the French cavalry was blocking the line of sight of their own artillery, who could no longer fire at the Spanish for fear of hitting their own king. Francis still had a force of 6,000 infantry, including 4,000 Landsknechts in reserve. These men were sent forward to relieve the cavalry. However, it was too late. Many of the finest French knights were either slain by the enemy pikes or shot from their horses. Sensing victory, Lannoy ordered Frundsberg, still fighting the French and Swiss infantry in the east, to send one of his pike squares west to reinforce the infantry fighting the French knights. Frundsberg arrived just in time, cutting off the French retreat. Now totally surrounded, King Francis I had no choice but to surrender. With their king taken prisoner, resistance from the rest of the French army completely collapsed. The French army was in full rout. Only the Black Band, a force of German and Italian Landsknecht mercenaries, fought on. The Germans fighting for Charles V saw the Black Band as traitors to the Emperor, and so they exterminated them where they stood, to the last man. To the south of the main battle, the Spanish garrison inside Pavia, led by Leyva, saw similar success. De Leyva's forces sallied forth and broke through the French defenses at the Five Abbeys, finishing the annihilation of the French forces at Pavia. By mid-morning, the battle was over, and Charles de Lannoy was in shock, almost unable to believe his good fortune. Lannoy's expectations prior to the battle were not particularly high. In many ways, his original plan was much less ambitious than what ended up actually happening. He attempted to free the Spanish garrison inside Pavia, and by trying to engineer a tactical withdrawal, he had somehow won a glorious victory. The defeat at Pavia cost the French around 13,000 men, with most of their commanders being killed or captured as well, while the Spanish and German forces lost less than 3,000. The Battle of Pavia effectively ended the French invasion of Italy. Afterwards, the situation in France turned desperate. After hearing of the king's capture, Francis's mother, Louise of Savoy, became regent and quickly stabilized the situation, gaining allies in England, Italy, and even the Ottoman Empire. Although Charles V had soundly beaten the French, more problems were surfacing over his vast empire, and he was eager to make peace. King Francis was taken to Madrid, where he was imprisoned until he signed the Peace of Madrid in January of 1526. In this treaty, Francis promised to marry Charles's sister and relinquish his territorial claims to Milan and French Burgundy. King Francis was released and returned to Paris. He then immediately reneged on the treaty. A new treaty was signed in 1529 at Cambrai, which required Francis to pay war reparations and relinquish his territorial claims in Italy. While the Battle of Pavia did not immediately end the Italian wars, it marked a major turning point. Following a brief period of peace, Charles V and Francis I would continue to spar over Italy for many years following Pavia, recruiting the help of several allies from all over Europe. Mutinous German troops would sack Rome in 1527, and the Ottoman Empire, allying with the French, would besiege Vienna in 1529. England would also enter the war on the side of the Habsburgs. This, however, would eventually lead to the French taking Calais in 1558, conquering England's last territory in continental Europe. Despite this, the French were unable to wrest control of Italy from the empire, and Habsburg domination over Italy became the new status quo. The Italian Wars was truly one of the darkest chapters in Italian history. Niccolo Machiavelli, in his book The Prince, described in Italy more enslaved than the Hebrews, more servile than the Persians, more dispersed than the Athenians, without a head, without order, beaten, despoiled, torn, pillaged, and having endured ruin of every sort. After years of foreign invasions, this sort of sentiment became popular at the time. It was the hope of Machiavelli that his writings could serve to help Italy survive this tumultuous time period, and perhaps, one day, remove the foreigners